My name is Paul Leto of the American Enterprise Institute and the America in the World Consortium. I am delighted to moderate this panel of distinguished scholars and government servants in various forms. What I will do is I will introduce all three of the panelists. Then we will have the presentations seriatim, and then we'll do Q&A all together at the end. Our first panelist is now Lieutenant Colonel Benn Griffin. Colonel Griffin is Chief of the Military History Division at West Point. He is a military intelligence officer who has served in the 10th Mountain Division and in the 1st Infantry Division. He has been deployed twice to Iraq. Ben graduated from West Point and has 2 master's degrees, one from the University of Arizona and one from the University of Texas, and a PhD from Texas. Hook 'em horns. Richard Marsh here is a historian with the United States Air Force, where he has served since 2021 as the Deputy Command Historian at NORAD and NORTHCOM. And those of you who were all Reagan wonks here, I'm sure everyone knows that NORAD itself played an important role in Reagan's development, in his mind, of SDI. Rich is also an adjunct professor of history at the U.S. Air Force Academy. And in the best tradition of joint service, Rich is also a graduate, but of West Point, has taught there and served on active duty for 11 years as an Army officer. And as it turns out, Rich and Ben were actually classmates at West Point, which is a very small world. And Rich's doctorate is from Ohio State. Or I think I'm technically supposed to say the Ohio State University. Is that right? Don't indulge. The comment here is don't indulge them, which is funny. Andrew Mead McGee on the screen. Andrew, through no fault of his own, is joining us remotely, but we're glad he's with us. Andrew has achieved every child's dream of working at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum, where Andrew is the curator of computing. He has previously taught at Washington and Lee and at Carnegie Mellon, and served as the Kluge Fellow in Digital Studies at the Library of Congress. Andrew is a graduate of Harvard and UVA, and is currently working on a book on the political history of computing in the United States from the 1940s to the 1980s. So a really wonderful and distinguished panel, and we're looking forward to their presentations. And why don't we start off with Ben?
Thank you, Paul, for the very nice introduction, and thank you really to the organizers for putting on such a fantastic and just well-run event. As Paul noted, I am an active duty Army officer, so I got to give the standard disclaimer here. All the opinions are mine, not necessarily the government's, Department of Defense's, the Army's, or West Point's. This is all me, so if I'm wrong, it's definitely my fault, probably doubly or triply so here. So in 1980, just after the election, about 30 miles southeast of here, a really interesting group of people got together. They included second man on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, astrophysicist Lal Wood, who was filling in for the father of the hydrogen bomb, Edward Teller, Oppenheimer, this past weekend. He's in there. And then also retired Army Lieutenant General Daniel Graham, who was a former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. The group got together to draft recommendations for the incoming Reagan administration's policy on space. Now, this is not necessarily unusual that a group wants to come in, leverage connections that they've forged largely through Hoover and the Lawrence Livermore Labs with the new administration. That's something that every administration has, right? All these job seekers and applicants, people want to influence policy. But what was kind of strange was the other aspect of this group's membership, science fiction writers. So the group met at the house of Larry Niven, and then Jerry Pournelle was the primary kind of organizer of the group. And so again, you have this group of science fiction writers, scientists, military minds, and actual astronauts come together here in Southern California to talk about space. And in particular, they want to talk about space defense and give recommendations on how the administration should look at forming what will become the Strategic Defense Initiative. The writers that are involved, they had some R&D experience. Pournelle had been at Boeing in the 60s. Heinlein, who was there as well, was in the Navy in the Second World War. But none had been involved in any kind of R&D really for the past 20 years or so, give or take. But their role was really to help craft what the group was putting together and make it more accessible and make it more readable. And so they come up with this paper. They give it to incoming National Security Advisor Richard Allen to give to Reagan. And apparently he reads it, and he really likes it, that what they put together. And so Allen comes back and says, hey, we'd love for you to kind of come back and do more, right? So keep kind of giving us your views on this space policy. This included on the 1983 address, which announced SDI. Primary speechwriter for that, Dana Rohrabacher, recalled having access to a lot of creativity as he was working on that speech. Cornell claimed that the line that it would be better to save lives than to avenge them came from the group, although I've seen a lot of different people claiming that line because it's a really good line. But again, it's showing this connection between science fiction writers and a speech laying out a pretty major policy initiative for Reagan. Now, the prominent role of fiction writers actually was kind of a masterstroke by what became known as the Citizens Advisory Council for Space Policy, because I would argue that no administration before or since has cared as much about popular culture as the Reagan administration does. So Reagan, obviously, having been an actor, was very closely attuned to the power of narrative, right? Particularly the power of popular narrative that are going to be consumed by millions and millions of people. And so because of this, he and those around them throughout their time in office actively sought to influence the popularity of a variety of movies, books, and television shows that they felt furthered the administration goals while subverting movies, books, and television shows that thought ran counter to the administration's goals. Like I said, it's unsurprising that Reagan cared deeply about these stories. The telling of stories really defined his life, right? Dating back to his days as a sportscaster, Dutch Reagan on WHO Radio Des Moines, through his time in Hollywood, interactions with GE employees while he's going around touring their faculties as part of his duties as the host of General Electric Theater, and then as governor of California. Right? He was famous for trapping jokes and anecdotes, keeping them in a little file box or index card thing by his desk, and he'd free them at an opportune moment in order to kind of further his political message. His tendency to launch a familiar story was a source of his appeal in the eyes of George Shultz, who saw them as something that helped create meaning, as well as Caspar Weinberger, who believed they were responsible for the president's high standing and popularity with the American public. For Reagan, a good story or joke contained an insightful truth about the world or an idea, and when repeated, would propagate its meaning in a powerful and lasting way. Right? You tell a funny joke, someone else tells that same joke, and all of a sudden that message that you put in the joke has gone much further than that first interaction. Right? That's kind of how Reagan approached this idea. And so as he entered office, he had long been concerned about the state of popular culture in the United States. He wrote in 1970 to Frank McCarthy, who was a retired brigadier general and a producer with 20th Century Fox. He wrote to praise the studio's recent movie, Patton. The movie to Reagan was magnificent and said some things that very much needed saying. George Scott's portrayal of the famously aggressive general was a counter to the pernicious and constant degrading of the military taking place after the Vietnam or amid the Vietnam War. In Reagan's mind, Patton then was a lonely beacon of positivity in a decade of starkly negative portrayals. Right? And we see this early in his presidency as well. In one of his first planned major foreign policy speeches at my alma mater of West Point, there's a draft of the speech. And the draft took the industry to task for its reprehensible pandering to anti-militarism and anti-Americanism. And interestingly, handwritten in the margins of this draft are a list of films that underline the point, notably including Apocalypse Now and The Deer Hunter. Now, those two films, which portray service members as deeply damaged and immoral, amassed 17 Academy Award nominations and 6 wins, including 1 for Best Picture, which probably contributed to Reagan's belief that the film industry was rewarding a particular narrative at the time. And so this didn't make the final draft of the speech. Reagan does not attack Hollywood in the speech. He doesn't single out these movies. Rohrabacher recalls that was because they wanted to avoid making an enemy of Hollywood right at the start of the administration. And so instead, kind of in his typical way, Reagan sought to highlight more positive ones, stories that he thought. And for him, those are ones which the U.S. wore a white hat, right? They come the old cowboy stories that Reagan tended to like. And as long as the story being told had a character who prevailed because they adhered to a strong moral code, didn't necessarily seek credit for that, that was the kind of story that Reagan liked. Some advisors call it as like a high noon story or a Marshall Cain type of story, which there's a really interesting subversion of that movie, of misunderstanding, because High Noon's actually written about McCarthyism, which Reagan, I don't think, quite grasped. And so we see throughout his time in office, he's starting to bring in stars that he thinks are on message. One of these is Sylvester Stallone. So Stallone in August '85 attends a fundraiser out here in California and reportedly wants to give Ronald Reagan a life-size poster of himself as Rambo. And Reagan seems amenable, but the White House is like, please don't do this. Please do not give him a giant-sized Rambo. There's a second one that featured Rambo's body with Reagan's face as well in this story. So he doesn't give it to him, but he does come back to the White House later on. And Reagan, for his part, really enjoyed the movie Rambo, right? He spoke to the press saying, hey, the next time there's a hostage crisis, I know what to do now, right? We're gonna bring in Rambo and we're gonna solve this sucker. And so Stallone, along with his Rocky IV co-star, Bridget Nelson, at the time his fiancée, soon to be his wife, attended a state dinner for the Prime Minister of Singapore, which led the Washington Post to accuse the White House of using the star power to focus off any serious problems confronting the administration. And there's probably some truth to this, right? Look at this movie star who is now in the 4th and 5th highest grossing films of the year between Rambo 2 and Rocky 4. But also, Reagan loved the message of those films, right? Because in 1985, Stallone won this time in Vietnam and ends the Cold War on Christmas Day in the Soviet Union by beating up Yavin Drago, which is weird foreshadowing of the end of the Soviet Union on Christmas Day a few years later. Michael J. Fox was also at this same state dinner. He had starred in the year's highest grossing film, Back to the Future, and he met Nancy Reagan during the event. And he was really worried because he thought that the Reagans had seen the movie and would be concerned about the joke that Reagan was the punchline of in the movie, right? When, Marty McFly is trying to prove that he is from the future, Doc Brown asks him, hey, who's the president? Ronald Reagan, the actor, right? But Nancy assures him that both of them loved the film. And that makes sense because really the themes of the movie, this sort of 1950s nostalgia, fit very well. And even the Libyans making an appearance as the bad guys kind of fits the messages that Reagan is putting out, right? So we're seeing these movies in '85, again, the number 1, number 4, number 5 movies of the year, very much in line with what Reagan wants to do. But also he looked to highlight novelists. Right? So one of those novelists he highlighted often was James Michener. Michener rose to prominence in the 1950s. He kind of became the go-to guy for the government to introduce new systems. And that sort of. So Christina Klein notes in her book that Michener put his writing in the service to the government. He's the person who first introduced the B-52 to the American people. And he wrote his novella, The Bridges of Toko Ri, looking at the actions of a carrier group operating during the war. And Reagan latched onto this story very early on and referenced it constantly in his speeches about the military, most notably bringing up the fleet commander, Admiral Terrence line at the end of the book of where do we get such men, right? Because they just lost a couple of pilots and they're still going on. And then Reagan would answer this, we get them where we always have in our cities and our towns and our villages, right? This really great line of framing where we're drawing this new all-volunteer force from. But Reagan also looked for other ways to recognize Michener beyond citing Bridges of Toko Ri repeatedly in speeches. There's 6 or 7 of them that I found so far that he's using the same line, the same framing in. In 1983, he called for the establishment of a national award for the arts, which is supposed to mirror the National Science Medal, and wanted Michener to be one of the inaugural recipients of the award. The day prior to that ceremony, he also tapped Michener for the Board of International Broadcasting, which oversaw the actions of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, right? So trying to bring in, Michener and his strong anti-communist message into the fold, kind of in the active revitalization of these efforts we see in the 80s with Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Of course, no author benefited more from Reagan's attention to popular culture than Tom Clancy. Started off the decade as an insurance agent in Maryland, ends the decade as one of the best-selling authors of that decade and also the 90s, actually. Hunt for October, his first book, went from a local success to bestseller after Reagan praised it as unputdownable and the perfect yarn. White House meeting shortly after saw Clancy interact with Reagan, but also John Lehner, Brent Scowcroft, a number of other prominent kind of national security minds operating within the administration. Clancy, in this meeting, assured him that in his next book, the good guys would win in the sequel, which was a World War III called Red Storm Rising that played a pretty prominent role in Reagan's thinking heading into Reykjavik, which we can get into in Q&A if y'all are interested. This opened doors for Clancy because now he found he could go anywhere, right? Anywhere that, any base, any institution, wanted them in there, and gave him access to both classified and unclassified information to help drive this narrative forward. Because he was telling a message very favorable to the Reagan administration and very consciously doing that. He intentionally incorporated these messages in that way. Though the Iran-Contra crisis does show kind of a risk to this approach, because both Michener and Clancy respond negatively as the news is unfolding with Iran-Contra. In Clearing Present Danger, the last book Clancy writes during the administration, comes out afterwards. Kind of the final scene, or the final important scene of the book, is Clancy's avatar, Jack Ryan, in the Oval Office berating the president for supposedly knowing better, or should have known better, for all the things that unfolded in the book, where he had a national security advisor who had gone rogue. Michener is a bit more strident. He publishes his legacy and writes it in a very short period of time, looking at an officer, Major Norman Starr, who was kind of the anti-Oliver North. Right, both Starr and North are both very decorated, but in Michener's story, Starr decides to go testify before Congress, not wearing his uniform, implying he's going to tell everything he knows to the committee. And in the press for the book, Michener noted that he believed that North acted in complete harmony with Casey, who kept President Reagan informed through the back door. But despite this late break, Michener spent really the first 6-7 years of administration really carrying a lot of water for the Reagan administration. Reagan was not the only person that sought to leverage pop culture in the administration. Cap Weinberger is another really big one. He had written book reviews for the San Fran Chronicle really for decades prior, when he was working as a assemblyman in California. And he took that skill with him to the Pentagon. So he penned reviews of Clancy's Hunt for October and Patriot Games, appearing in the Times Later Supplements and the Wall Street Journal. Hunt for October had many lessons for those who want to keep the peace, and Patriot Games showed U.S. capabilities up to the limit of classification, probably a little beyond, actually. Like Reagan, Weinberger appreciated Clancy's depiction of U.S. military capabilities as effective and his service members as virtuous, something that the New York Times praised or called out in their review of Red Storm Rising, which they deemed good news for the defense secretary in 1986. Clancy gave the Pentagon what Weinberger had hoped that Alan Jury would. So Alan Jury, another noted author, wrote the book Advise and Consent, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1960. Weinberger had reviewed it at the time, praised it, has a pretty strong anti-communist message to it as well. And so when Jury wrote to Weinberger saying, hey, I want to write a book about the Pentagon, Weinberger was all in. Right, he wanted this to happen. And so he gave special access to the author, let him shadow him for a day, gave him a month pass to the building, which ended up producing the book kind of uncreatively titled Pentagon. But unfortunately, it was both a critical and a commercial flop. But again, it is showing the interest in kind of cultivating these relationships with well-known figures, trying to get the message out there. Weinberger also would attack those that were critical of the administration. Special disdain was reserved for Robert Ludlum. So the writer of spy thrillers, most notably The Bourne Identity, Bourne Supremacy, Bourne Ultimatum, later made into a series of movies with Matt Damon. In his review of The Bourne Supremacy, which also was in the Wall Street Journal, Weinberger lamented that the required Le Carré syndrome had full reign in the novel, as the author went out of his way to demonstrate those on our side are also guilty. Because Weinberger feared Ludlum's readers might really think this was the way the government's business was done. Le Carré was another author that the administration kind of feared. Charles Hill noted that he was one of the few kind of popular authors at the time that wrote literature, right, which is kind of high praise come from Charles Hill. But unfortunately, it was in a way that showed the kind of moral equivalency going on in the Cold War, right? So he didn't like that Le Carré showed, U.S. and British agents doing bad things as they tried to run down Carla. Weinberger took aim at Le Carré again in his view of William Buckley's Mongoose R.I.P., celebrating the book by the conservative icon may not have always showed the CIA in the best light, but it did show the agency's work as critically important and frequently dangerous. Weinberger unnecessarily noted that Buckley, the founding editor of the National Review, was no John Le Carré. Obviously, he's not going to be doing that. And he would then kind of follow Buckley into writing fiction as well, as Weinberger would write The Next War in the mid-'90s, which is a series of fictional vignettes aimed at kind of promoting a more robust defense policy, as well as the thriller Chain of Command in the early 2000s, both of which were written with Peter Schweitzer. Looking at television, 1983's TV movie The Day After demonstrates again intent to try to control the message, right? They were very concerned that the graphic, at least for the time, depiction of nuclear attack would further invigorate the anti-nuclear movement. In his diary, Reagan noted the movie left him greatly depressed, but thought it was blatant anti-nuclear propaganda and resolved to, quote, take over the impact and the messaging of the film. To do so, they asked the networks to air a town hall featuring Secretary of State George Shultz immediately after the movie aired. Now, these fears kind of proved unfounded as the movie was not as successful as they'd been worried about. The administration kind of thinks the commercial breaks interspersed through broke up the dramatic tension and lessened the impact of the movie. And probably for this reason, the next year when TBS aired BBC's Threads, which is even bleaker than the day after, which is kind of hard to believe, there was not much of a response from the administration on that one. But to kind of wrap up, I want to bring this back to my opening story about the Citizens Advisory Council, because really the impact of this elevation and these attacks on pop culture are perhaps most clearly seen within American science fiction during the period. Because throughout the 1980s, Pournelle, Niven, Heinlein, Poul Anderson continued their work with the council and also used every chance they had to advocate for SDI. The result was a civil war. As Pournelle recalls, the topic damn near split science fiction in America in half. Heavyweights Isaac Asimov and Arthur Clarke entered the debate against the program, arguing in books, congressional testimony, and articles that was infeasible, expensive, and provocative. The previously strong friendship between Heinlein and the other two kind of pillars of sci-fi's golden age fractured. It gets very ugly as this goes along. After Clarke testified before Congress against the program, Heinlein confronted him, questioning why someone born in the UK felt they should comment on U.S. policy. And he attacked his scientific understanding. The attack deeply wounded Clarke. They never mended that relationship. And although Clarke kind of came around to SDI in the 90s, it still felt deeply betrayed by what happened between him and Heinlein. Asimov attacked Heinlein as an author of far-right persuasion and as being a well-known apostle of the righteousness of violence. In his autobiography, written after Heinlein died, the writer expressed confusion about someone who was a, quote, flaming liberal during the Second World War, but advocated such positions, attributing to Heinlein's second marriage and also a meanness of spirit in the author of Starship Troopers. For his part, Heinlein was undeterred by Asimov's attacks and his resistance. Instead, he donated $40,000 to Daniel Graham's High Frontiers group, which advocated for missile defense, and then also wrote the foreword to Graham's book of the same name, calling SDI the best news he had heard since VJ Day. Heinlein also dedicated The Cat Who Walks Through Walls, the next to last novel published in his life, to his fellow council members who were men to have at your back. The argument was personal because they believed they had a personal stake in the policy and in the success. And this transcended from them to their broader fan base, right? Science fiction fans got very involved in this, as did the broader publishing community. Jim Baen established a short-lived journal and then a long-lived publishing house, Baen Books, as a way to provide more access to some of the more right-wing authors. Notably, author Walter John Williams recalled Baen's politics were somewhat to the right of Attila the Hun. And though Baen did publish books from across the spectrum, it did become kind of the go-to for conservative authors. This would eventually include Newt Gingrich, who published his first book, Window of Opportunity, with Tor Publishing, but his first fictional work, The Alt World War II History 1945, with Baen Books in the early 1990s. And so one of the animating principles of how Reagan communicated was that stories mattered, right? And that's kind of what's running through all of this, is that these short fictional stories are ones people carry with them. And so they're very important then. Because he believed that a memorable story with a message was a potent way to shape an audience, and thought that, and brought this process into his presidency. The attunement that resulted led to that interaction between the novelist and the creators, and just showed this mutual shaping, right? Because the authors influenced Reagan and vice versa, really show this really difficult to unpack relationship between audiences, creators, and policymakers as you're looking at the Reagan administration. The final connection that I want to highlight between Reagan and that first meeting of the Citizens Advisory Council is where it took place. Again, I mentioned 30 miles southeast of here. That is the city of Tarzana, named for Tarzan, from science fiction writer Edgar Rice Burroughs, who was an inspirational figure to pretty much everyone, scientist, engineer, writer in that room, but also to Reagan. Reagan's perhaps favorite all-time fictional character, John Carter of Mars. Those are the books that he called reading as a young boy in Iowa. The tales were ones that he professed love for throughout his life. The Virginian turned Martian, again, was certainly on the short list of his favorite characters. He carried those stories with him as he entered the Oval Office, as did those writers and scientists out in Tarzana in 1980. So again, stories not only matter, then they last as well. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Rich, take it away. Okay.
I do have some slides.
And can I just, Andrew, are you still with us? All right. Well,
yes.
Okay, great.
Well, thanks to everybody for being here, and thanks to the Reagan Foundation for hosting this first-class conference. It's really been a pleasure so far. So the title of my paper that I'm going to present today is called Promoting Liberal Democracy in El Salvador in the Age of Reagan. So Stephen F. Hayward and Sean Wilentz, among others, have argued that the era of liberal preeminence that began with the New Deal fell amidst the social rebellion of the late 1960s, and in doing so loosed the political tide that would eventually lift Ronald Reagan to the U.S. presidency and usher in an age of Reagan that would persist at least until the end of the century. In considering the age of Reagan, the question I want to address today is, what did the fall of a liberal order, organized around the idea that government should be the exponent of social progress and the proponent of individual liberty, mean for the foreign policy of Reagan in Central America? Some have argued that Reagan's rise meant a return to the reactionary interventions of the early Cold War. In the case of Central America, a reprise of President Eisenhower's overthrow of the social democratic government of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, and its replacement by a rightist dictatorship. Scholars have cited the president's support to the government of El Salvador and the Nicaraguan Contras to buttress this argument. Today, I want to challenge that idea by focusing on the Reagan administration's intervention in El Salvador. I will argue that the premises and justifications of the El Salvador intervention differed from those of previous interventions in the region as sharply as Reagan's beliefs differed from those of his liberal predecessors about the relationship of the individual to the government. Liberals of the 1950s and 1960s engaged in Central America on the premise that the United States could modernize the economies, societies, and politics of nations through infusions of aid and funding of development programs, and in doing so, could put the nations on the path to democracy. Reagan, in contrast, engaged in El Salvador on the premise that the citizens of Central American nations, acting through elected legislators and executives under the rule of law, could themselves transform a deeply unjust society into a democratic one. Quite the contrary to those who portray Reagan as a ruthless cold warrior in Central America, it was Reagan rather than his liberal predecessors who eschewed authoritarians and committed to building liberal democratic institutions in El Salvador. I want to make the point today that Reagan's rebellion against state-directed social uplift and domestic policy brought with it a concomitant rejection of authoritarians in Central America. Instead of a return to a preference for anti-communist dictators, the advent of a conservative president and the end of Cold War liberalism brought an end to the acceptance in U.S. foreign policy for dictatorship in Central America. Instead of relying on dictators for Cold War wins, Reagan enshrined the formal institutions of liberal democracy as the guarantor of U.S. security interests and the fountainhead of liberty in the region. Reagan's El Salvador policy evidenced this change. The age of Reagan was an age of a fundamentalist faith in the power of institutions of liberal government to transform a society, absent any antecedent changes in the material conditions of that society. I'll make 3 points in support of that claim today. First, the foreign policy of Cold War liberals toward Central America favored pursuing social modernization over upholding a political system in which parties compete for legislative power by popular vote and then produce laws that are enforced by an executive and interpreted by courts. Because of this preference for social progress, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson, for example, accepted the modernizing dictatorships that prevailed in El Salvador and elsewhere during their presidencies. The second point I will make is that the human rights movement of the 1970s marked an end to American liberals' tolerance of modernizing dictatorships, and it constrained future presidencies from supporting despots in the name of anti-communism. And third, the administration of Ronald Reagan subsumed the human rights discourse into its overarching policy of promoting the institutions of liberal democracy in El Salvador, and thereby created a durable congressional majority for that policy. Okay, so point number one. The liberal era that preceded Reagan elevated a foreign policy towards Central America that saw social progress in the region as an antecedent to liberty. This thinking was the reverse of the thinking of Reagan as a conservative president, who as a conservative president would later apply to Central America. The high tide of post-war liberal foreign policy towards Latin America crested with the Alliance for Progress of the 1960s. The alliance represented the cutting edge of liberal social development thinking of the day. It was the incarnation of modernization theory and the liberal belief in the state as the agent of social progress. According to the modernization theorists, a society had to first transition from a, quote, traditional society, unquote, to a modern society before representative government could take hold and individual rights could be honored. At the least, progress toward the social forms of modern American society, which the theorists saw as the model of modernity, naturally accompanied free government. As Kennedy proclaimed in his announcement of the alliance, quote, liberty and progress walk hand in hand, unquote. The alliance was a failure in the sense that it did not achieve the revolution in liberty that the president had sought. Alliance programs declined in the late 1960s as violence, repression, and military dictatorship rose throughout Latin America. Of the reasons it failed, not the least of which was the clash rather than the complementarity between liberty and progress in Central American societies. The pursuit of progress through rationalized agriculture, industrialization, modern education, and other initiatives threatened vested interests, individual rights, and other prerogatives that liberty would presumably honor. Political consensus on whether progress or liberty was the greater value proved elusive. As a result, State Department and alliance officials found themselves needing a constituency for their programs, and they sometimes found it in the least democratic body within Latin American societies, the military. The formulators of alliance policy generally saw Latin American militaries as centrist forces in political systems polarized between right and left. Since reactionaries wedded to the status quo opposed any social progress, and leftists were content with nothing short of socialist revolution, State Department officials sought a constituency that would embrace alliance development programs and thereby provide an ordered path to democracy. In the eyes of some officials, military officers composed such a constituency. A state that sought the ordered uplift of society was the goal, and if that state were run by a military regime, it was acceptable, if not ideal. Okay, so that brings me to point number two. The reaction to these sorts of policies provided the context out of which Reagan's El Salvador policy would eventually take shape. Reagan and the rest of the budding conservative movement were not the only ones to reject the line of thought the United States could manage change in foreign societies by financing state-led programs. The New Left and the anti-establishment protesters of the 1960s denounced the managerial state, as did left-wing members of Congress. Two of the legislators that led the progressives turn away from state-led modernization and foreign policy were Senator Frank Church and Congressman Donald Frazier. Senator Church decried counterproductive policies that not only failed to make social progress in Latin America, but also emboldened the region's military dictatorships. He wanted an end to modernization programs and disengagement with regimes inimical to American values. And I think this quote on the slide that I have displayed here sums up his position pretty well. Okay. In the House of Representatives, Donald Frazier led the way in attaching human rights provisions to foreign assistance legislation. Frazier's subcommittee on international organizations and movements recommended a withdrawal of military and economic assistance to governments that violated their citizens' human rights. By 1976, Congress had attached such caveats to laws funding the International Development and Food Assistance Programs, the Inter-American Development Bank, as well as International Security Assistance Acts. In Congress, enthusiasm for human rights took the form of a backlash against foreign policies that had failed to make moral progress in the Third World. The human rights movement therefore set the stage for Reagan's policy in El Salvador in the 1980s in two ways. First, it ruled out congressional permission for material support of dictatorships in Central America. And second, it elevated the protection of individual rights over the material condition of society as a whole. Reagan's El Salvador policy would operate within these constraints and thereby set a new precedent for democracy promotion in Central America. So that brings me to my third point. Foreign policy towards El Salvador in the age of Reagan was marked by an inversion of liberals' thinking about the relationship between democracy and social uplift, and by an absorption and circumspection of the 1970s human rights movement, the 1970s human rights movement's demands for the protection of individual rights. Reagan's El Salvador policy took shape in the midst of the foreign policy crisis engendered by the Salvadoran Civil War. The overthrow of the country's decades-long military dictatorship by a group of reform-minded military officers and civilian intellectuals in 1979, shortly after Nicaragua's Sandinista revolution, touched off the Civil War, which pitted a reformist government against opponents from both a reactionary right and a revolutionary left under the banner of the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, the FMLN. As far as U.S. foreign policy, it set up a tug of war between the Reagan administration and Congress over funding for the new Salvadoran government. The resolution of this aid money fight between the administration and the Congressional Human Rights constituency marked a turning point in U.S. foreign policy toward El Salvador and Central America as a whole. The United States would no longer set social progress as its foreign policy aim, nor would it attempt to compel governments to demonstrate that all human rights were being honored across the nation as a prerequisite for aid. Instead, the Reagan administration would set a precedent that U.S. foreign policy would concentrate on upholding the processes and institutions of liberal democratic government, work to bring into the political system the forces currently in armed opposition to it, and then let the opposing parties work out their differences through the system. The revolutionary government junta, the JRG, that came to power in October 1979 offered the prospect of either advancement to liberal democracy or return to authoritarian rule. On the one hand, its progressive members sought to first break the power of the country's landholding elite by expropriating their vast landholdings and distributing them amongst the nation's landless campesinos. They would then write a new constitution that would set up a government with popular legitimacy. On the other hand, the JRG was dependent for its survival on the same military men who had ruled the country at the behest of the agrarian elite and had repressed the dissent for the past 50 years. Depending on whether a progressive or a reactionary faction gained sway within the clannish Armed Forces Officer Corps, reform could either proceed or be undone. The JRG required military aid because it was beset by violent challenges from both an insurgency and that saw socialist revolution and terrorist reactionaries that sought a return to the status quo ante. The country's armed forces were the only ones standing between these armed groups and the dissolution of the fledgling government, yet many of its officers were suspected of aiding the reactionary side. The previous administration of President Jimmy Carter had been on the horns of a dilemma given the Cold War context of the Civil War. Either support a junta government reliant on unsavory individuals, or allow it to fall and thereby permit the rise of a regime aligned with Cuba and hostile to the United States. Carter had made promotion of human rights central to his foreign policy toward the Central American states. But because he had approached human rights in a punitive and reactive fashion, the situation in El Salvador had proven especially vexing. Carter had held out the prospect of military support to the JRG if only the military would stop murdering civilians overtly or covertly through clandestine death squads. During 1980, the final year of Carter's presidency, the death squads continued to operate, and Carter continued to withhold lethal aid, that is, munitions, from until the FMLN forced a reckoning with its so-called final offensive of January 1981. The FMLN launched attacks at dozens of locations across the country, pressuring the armed forces to the breaking point. The armed forces repelled the offensive, but were so short on ammunition afterward that President Carter realized the JRG's viability hung in the balance. He relented to the entreaties of Jose Napoleon Duarte, El Salvador's most famous Democrat, now president of the JRG, and provided $5 million worth of arms to the Salvadoran armed forces in the last days of his presidency. Unlike Carter, Reagan resolved to support the JRG from the outset of his presidency. But he faced a Congress which, as the seat of human rights activism within the U.S. government, was understandably skeptical of the new Salvadoran government. Hundreds of civilians every week were being found dead on the streets throughout the country, victims of the death squads. The JRG proved incapable of bringing the killers to justice. In the United States, the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere Affairs, responsible for the authorizing legislation for the aid money, became the locus of opposition to Reagan's professed support for the JRG. Over the next 3 years, it would clash with the administration on the issue of support for the JRG and its successor government. The administration's debate with congressional human rights advocates boiled down to whether U.S. policy should be to preserve the integrity of the JRG and facilitate its program to build liberal democratic institutions, or to force it to abandon its plans for a new constitution and elections, and instead dissolve itself to be reconstituted following the successful conclusion of negotiations with the FMLN. The policy of negotiation and dissolution favored by the congressional human rights advocates would treat the Salvadoran government as one of two belligerent parties in need of a higher authority to reconcile them. The Reagan administration's policy, on the other hand, would treat the JRG and its successor interim government as an inviolable state that could only be reformed through the processes prescribed in its constitution. The administration got its way in the debate for two main reasons. On the domestic side, Reagan and his policymakers were able to recast the human rights cause in El Salvador as the cause of liberal democracy, and in doing so convince a majority of Congress to continue to fund military aid. On the foreign side, politicians in El Salvador were able to see through their plans to create new institutions to govern the country democratically. In the first months of the administration, Congress imposed human rights certification conditions on aid for El Salvador. The president had to certify that the government of El Salvador was making progress in enforcing the respect for human rights in order to extend military aid to the country. In response, Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs Thomas Enders laid out the basic policy the administration would follow for the remainder of Reagan's term. The administration would help El Salvador lay the groundwork for a democratic, pluralistic political system that would, in turn, allow a fractured Salvadoran society to live in peace with itself while gradually overcoming its divisions. Such a political system would be the best long-term guarantee for Salvadorans' human rights. Congressional critics rebuked the notion that democratic institutions could form in the midst of mass government repression, but Ambassador to the UN, Jeane Kirkpatrick, propounded a contrary explanation for the source of the violence in El Salvador. Kirkpatrick argued that the violence was not the scourge of a tyrannical state, but instead the result of the absence of order. She called it a, quote, a plague of anomic violence, unquote, that could not be checked by a government too weak to, quote, impose its sovereign will on society, unquote. The answer to the problem was to create institutions that secure the rights of a free society. She argued that the Salvadoran politicians writing a new constitution in the Constituent Assembly were the best chance for the country to build such institutions. The president used his bully pulpit to expand these concepts beyond El Salvador to the whole Caribbean basin and then to the entirety of humanity. His 1982 Caribbean Basin Initiative sought to, quote, strengthen pluralism and build representative and responsive institutions, churches, free trade unions, and an independent press, unquote, and nurture basic human rights. In his speech to the British Parliament at Westminster later that year, he identified liberal democracy as the antidote to the totalitarianism that had afflicted the world and aimed to foster, quote, the infrastructure of democracy, unquote, as the means for people to, quote, reconcile their own differences through peaceful means, unquote. These arguments swayed Congress long enough for the Salvadoran Constituent Assembly to write a new constitution and hold an election in March 1984 that elevated Jose Napoleon Duarte to the presidency of El Salvador and his Christian Democrat Party to a majority in the country's legislature. This outcome was not preordained. It was due to the cooperation of Salvadoran reformers and the U.S. officials implementing foreign policy amidst violence and intense opposition. After the election of a Constituent Assembly to write the Constitution in March 1982, the Assembly, under the direction of the Armed Forces, had appointed an interim president, Alvaro Magana, a financier palatable to the right, but also committed to democratic reform. Magana had maintained a political coalition that staved off rightist attempts to reimpose an authoritarian political system. Instead, the Constitution his assembly produced had codified the liberal democratic character of the new state. Free elections, majority rule, and the formal equality of political parties, along with the protection of private property, among other rights. Duarte's election marked a turning point in U.S. foreign policy toward El Salvador. Following the election, Congress no longer challenged the president's certifications that El Salvador was making progress in human rights. As long as Duarte's government was not overthrown, aid would continue. As the Civil War drug on, the Salvadoran armed forces continued to commit human rights abuses and resisted prosecution by the justice system. But Reagan faced no more resistance to his support for El Salvador because Congress had accepted his thesis that the presence of liberal democratic institutions, even if they functioned imperfectly, could gradually reform a society. Reagan's idea that, just to wrap up now, Reagan's idea that all people, regardless of economic or historical circumstances, were capable of liberty was a far cry from the claim, central to the old liberal order, that liberty first required social progress. As the age of Reagan rose, so would the prominence of that idea, the lodestar of the Reagan doctrine and the Reaganite understanding of the purpose of America in the world. Sean Wilentz argues in his interpretation of the age of Reagan that the age of Reagan reached its culminating point during the war in Iraq that began in 2003. I think the same could be said for the thinking that the United States could drive societal change by implanting democratic institutions in nations that had previously existed under authoritarian rule. Thank you very much.
Rich, I like how you tucked a terribly provocative thesis in there at the end. I'm sure we'll come back to it shortly. Andrew, and I know there we go. All right. It's all yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and thank you for arranging these special accommodations. I wanted to thank my fellow panelists, Dr. Griffin and Dr. Marsh, for very interesting talks, and thank you to Dr. Leto for chairing this, and thank you to the audience for coming post-lunch to this session. I wish I could be there with you in Simi Valley, but an unexpected case of appendicitis means I can't fly. So I am happy to join you via Zoom and appreciate the accommodations made by the Reagan Foundation. I won't go through a formal presentation per se. I won't throw up any slides since I am talking to you from what I assume is a laptop perched precariously on a chair or maybe the edge of the dais. So or perhaps I'm on the big screen. If so, I wave at you. I want to tie in with the themes that my fellow panelists brought up because there are a number of interesting similarities on this notion of how ideas and culture intertwine with policy and how cultural and ideological infrastructures can shape democratic challenges. I'm primarily a historian of technology, but I'm a political historian of technology. And what I would like to toss before the audience today in the hope of garnering some feedback and talking about where I might take this project in the future is a portion of a larger new manuscript I'm working on that looks at the transnational political economy of information technology in the 1970s and 1980s. Flows of capital, flows of energy, flows of data, and how all of those interweave in an age of electronic fund transfers, new types of computer programs and simulations and models, high-speed satellite technology, and most importantly, personal computing. And as I think about what digital morning in America would look like, and I consider what I want to write about the 1980s, I'm drawn to these themes of how in the Reagan era, conversations about computing, about computers as machines, computing as practice, the idea of what information technology could do are fundamentally transformed. And that transformation has both long legs culturally and technologically, but very real implications as well for how policy is conceived and implemented and how Americans think about how their society should be structured. Now, there have been a number of recent scholars working on these themes, Margaret O'Mara's book, The Code, looks at venture capital and the rise of Silicon Valley in the 1970s and 1980s. Jonathan Cooper-Smith did a book on the role of information technology in the end of the Cold War through the guise of the fax machine. Young scholars like Mark Adenoff write about the uses of computing and shifting opinions about the welfare state in the 1980s. What I propose to do with my project is examine the ways that rhetoric about computers, opinions about computing broadly defined as machines, as practice, as shorthand for what the future might mean, have effects very real on policy outcomes during the 1980s, but perhaps more broadly on how Americans are thinking about this interrelationship of technology and the changing economy and social order of Reagan-era America. Broadly, what I want to do is position the 1980s as a decade of transmutation. Typically, from the history of computing perspective, a great deal is written about the 1970s and stories of microcomputing, of counterculture, homebrew computer designers coming out of the 1960s. Technology histories that focus on specific devices and firms where the state is largely absent. Political discussion is largely absent. It's a cultural, it's a business motif. And this is what feeds into the 1980s. Then the story picks up in the 1990s, and it becomes a narrative of an emerging internet, new forms of corporate structure and technological networking. It's the political history of Al Gore's e-governance and invention of the internet and a looming digital divide. I'd like to counter that and pivot to the 1980s being a crucial decade, not a liminal space, but one in which fundamental transformation occurs precisely because of a larger, if at times out of sight, cultural discussion about the place of the computer and what it means in relation to economy, to workforce, to national security, to American ideas about entrepreneurship and ingenuity and technological solutionism. The computer becomes one node in many discussions in the period around freedom, around planning, around competition, and the way the computer slips throughout the decade in and out of other policy areas fascinates me. I'll give a brief outline of some of the themes that I want to cover, and then I'll close with an interesting inflection point that I feel gets at many of the tensions that I see so compelling in this area. When we think about histories of computing, there are histories of computer users and computer firms that often deal with very early computer companies on the East Coast, or then they deal with the rise of West Coast-based firms, their connections to the counterculture and or to the military-industrial complex. If you want to make a group of computer historians mad, you just sort of toss, the question is, oh, what was the first computer? Where was the first computer invented? You'll get a range of ideas. But what is constant throughout this narrative is the role of the state, both as a buyer of computers, as a patron and sponsor of contracts and computing technologies, and a core focus of the military-industrial complex that is so central to the story of computing. And that plays a major role in 1980s understandings of computing. But the state is still, if you argue, as I would like to, that the 80s are this period of transmutation where Reagan-era state market relations and then broader American society's framings of the place of technology are intertwining to create a new understanding of what computing means. And if we think about how computing is understood, we can march progressively and thematically through the decade. And where I started my investigations is in the 1980 and 1984 elections, examining how high technology, computers, information-based media technologies, software, chips, satellites, are discussed by candidates and proxies in relation to more traditional heavy manufacturing or established industries. What is new and distinctive about the computer and how it is made, how it's marketed, what it might mean for a future. How does technological and automated unemployment factor into these discussions? What does the computer say about potential transformations of American economy in terms of what we think, what we make on the factory floor, and what we think about the place of science and technology as part of our national identity? Then I look at how those discussions feed over in policy adjacent realms in the early 1980s in debates about technology transfer to developing nations and American allies, and then what form debates over exports of critical systems to the Soviet Union might mean. This is an interesting moment where you get debates about video game systems and the chips that power them, and questions about what sorts of technologies should be extended as an olive branch by Americans, what sorts of technologies are critical to national security. That conversation is occurring adjacent to conversations about the role of the technology sector in the larger marketplace. And here you have firms like IBM that find their position in American society much freer under Reagan-era regulations and attitudes towards markets than in previous decades. The Reagan Justice Department shuts down the decades-long antitrust suit against IBM that had started in the 1950s. And what you see emerge from this is a boom in personal computing, the rise of clone computers, and new types of corporate structure and financialization that will have dramatic effects on both the technology sector and American business in general. Cautious attitudes about how to approach potential antitrust challenges in the early 1980s led IBM to partner with a small firm called Microsoft that will then grow dramatically over the decade as software becomes fundamental to this narrative. I move to a cultural discussion by examining the growing prominence of Silicon Valley as a place, as a site of imagination. I don't exclude other sites of computing. The 1980s are the heyday of Ross Perot and the Silicon Prairie in Texas. But these all fuel a narrative of a new kind of digital regionalism and understandings of the prosperity of the computer industry that play on motifs of the American frontier and the prosperity of the West. In the 1840s, you go west, young man, to find your future in the gold fields of California. In the 1980s, you go west to find your fortune in the chip facilities of San Jose. It's an interesting counterbalance, and one in which different political camps take sometimes contrary, but sometimes aligned perspectives. We see the rise of the Atari Democrats during this period, and we see contra-narratives of what it means to embrace a type of digital future around software, around chip manufacture, around large-scale computing systems, and around personal computing and the intrusion of the computer into the home, what that means. Finally, I look at the ways in which all of these aspects converge in the late 1980s in saber-rattling and debates over a potential trade war between the United States and Japan over manufacture and distribution of microchips. It's a question of resource extraction, it's a question of market competition, it's a question of intellectual property, but it's also an embodiment of the fears of the United States' place in the post-war world, with rising international competition, with questions about the role of innovation in economic development, and more fundamental queries in the minds of journalists, policymakers, activists, and ordinary Americans chatting over dinner tables and office water coolers about what is this relationship between Americans and technology. Throughout this period, Reagan is a key figure, both because of his periodic statements on computing technologies, his previous role as governor of California, and his connection to the emerging computer industry in the late 1960s and early 1970s, but more importantly, because Reagan's general attitudes around the economy, around American culture and American identity become proxy words. They become the values and attitudes that Americans are using to understand and debate the role of the computer. Reagan, his supporters, his critics are framing American values, American culture in particular ways, and the computer slips into those discussions. And terms about the hot button attitudes towards labor, towards the Cold War, towards what the norms of American culture should be that dominate headlines in other areas of American civic life in the 1980s filter over as commentators, policymakers, and again, ordinary citizens articulate their understandings, their hopes, and their fears about what the computer might mean for America's future and what this world that is oncoming, guided by microchips and satellites, actually means. When it comes to how we frame those conversations, Reagan's words sort of cross barriers and pop up in unexpected ways. So as an example, if you talk about the culture wars of the 1980s, you might bring up the Stanford debates about the role of classical education in the humanities, the Western canon versus new, often identity-based theories. And as that debate is occurring on Stanford University's campus, up the road, the Stanford Research Institute and its associated research park are generating many of these digital technologies that are reshaping both the economy and discombobulating Americans. There's a sense of pride in we are creating something fundamentally different in regards to how our technology is interweaving with manufacturing, with media, with daily life in the increasing prominence of computers. But there's also this unsettling back of the mind question about what hath we wrought that you see reflected in media and popular culture of the period where rogue artificial intelligences have their way with Americans. I keep coming back as I try to frame my project focused on the rhetoric by digging into newspapers, trade journals, commentaries and books published during the period, magazines looking into popular culture, film and novels, but also speeches by public officials and memoirs of how folks are looking back after the fact. And as I approach these variety of sources, I keep coming back to a speech that Reagan gave in May of 1988 at Moscow State University that hints at both these tensions and the ways in which his supporters and critics took his words and the words of others who spoke about Americanness during this period and dissected them in relation to the computer. And when it comes to this speech, I'll just quote a little bit of it here. Reagan comes to Moscow to speak to this graduating class of the university. And he said, and he's positioned in front of a mural of the October Revolution in 1917. I'm sure terrible optics for some in the Reagan White House, but Reagan pivoted on that in his prepared remarks and said, standing here before a mural of your revolution, I want to talk about a very different revolution that is taking place right now, quietly sweeping the globe without bloodshed or conflict. Its effects are peaceful, but they will fundamentally alter our world, shatter old assumptions, and reshape our lives. It's easy to underestimate because it's not accompanied by banners or fanfare. It's been called the technological or information revolution, and its emblem, one might take the tiny silicon chip, no bigger than a fingerprint. One of these chips has more computing power than a room full of old-style computers. And then he continues, saying, progress is not foreordained. The key is freedom. Freedom of thought, freedom of information, freedom of communication. And he constantly frames this technological revolution, this transformative role of the microchip, of electronics, of digital technologies, of computers as a vanguard of economic freedom, as an extension of the American character, and as an embodiment of what the American dream and promise mean. And I want to explore that theme, how that tension is supported by some, opposed by others, and works its way through understandings of what the computer means to Americans in the 1980s, with the understanding that these attitudes become embedded both into the policies through which computers weave their way into government and to the economy, and into later attitudes that will manifest in the 1990s and the 2000s. I look forward to any comments or questions you might have, and look forward to chatting with the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all the panelists. I'm standing here just so I can make sure that, Andrew, that you hear me. Terrific conversations from all of you. We have about 25 minutes, and here's how I'd like to proceed. I will use the privilege of the chair. I have a question for each of the panelists, but what I'd like to do is kind of list all the questions and then have each of you quickly take them on, and then we'll have a discussion. And what I will do is collect 2 or 3 questions at a time and then go and unlike the standard caveat, which is be quick with your questions and comments, I will actually enforce it so that we can have a good conversation. Benn, no one was more anti-nuclear than Ronald Reagan. He was a genuine nuclear abolitionist, and I wonder if that was understood at the time and if that played out in the debates among science fiction writers. And then you dropped a nice verbal footnote about Red Storm Rising and the Reykjavik meeting, and I want to give you the time and space to tell us about that. Rich, you quote the Westminster speech, which I think is right. And this is a genuine question. I don't know. Did Reagan see the question of democratic values in a place like El Salvador as essentially utilitarian to his Cold War policy? That is, this is important to block and ultimately, hopefully, help defeat the Soviets? Or was it intrinsically important to him that the Salvadorans had a small R Republican government? Andrew, I love your reference to Moscow State. I think that was a hugely important speech. I'm sure you know this. George Shultz, in his conversations, particularly with Gorbachev in 1985 and 1986, if you don't have the memoranda of conversations from those meetings, they're all here, they're all declassified and released, you should get them. Shultz keeps coming back to what he calls the information age or the information revolution. And as I understand it, he was told by State Department officials, don't tell Gorbachev this. You're lecturing him, this won't go over well. And Shultz did it every time. And you get the sense that, Shultz was the ultimate diplomat and a very smooth character, but you had a sense that he had like a knife or a shiv and was just plunging it in Gorbachev and twisting every time he talked about it. And moreover, Shultz, I think he wrote his first book about computers in like 1960. He wrote about computers and business management when he was, I believe, dean at the Chicago School of Business. So he had been thinking about it a long time, and then of course he had been at Bechtel and coming out of the Bay Area in the late 70s. So he really did know of what he spoke. And then finally, I'm sure you know this, but John Poindexter was heavily involved and interested in these issues and is still alive. And just a suggestion to try to reach out to Admiral Poindexter and interview him if you haven't. So why don't I stop there, let the panelists kind of take on answers seriatim, and then let's have a discussion.
So, first question, were the authors aware of Reagan's anti-nuclear stance? I don't see a lot of evidence that they understood he was looking for abolition. I think the people on the side of SDI very much thought that he was earnest in his desire to create the anti-nuclear shield. Niven and Pornell wrote a book called Footfall, which features a whole bunch of very thinly disguised science fiction authors advising the president about how to combat an alien invasion. Again, along similar lines to that. His opponents certainly didn't think he was anti-nuclear. You can see that very prominently, like in comic books at the time. So Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns features the U.S. and the Soviets getting into a war over an island in the Caribbean called Coulter Maltese, then stand-in for Grenada. The exchange goes nuclear as Reagan enters into a bunker saying, well, the Soviets are really bad sports. We're in full hazmat suit, and there's this great sequence where Superman gets nuked. Nice scene with him about ready to punch the nuclear missile right on the nose cone, all dramatic backlit, and then it's a series of, he punches it, the nuke goes off, and he gets irradiated and looks horrible. And so that's one of the powerful images from there. For the Red Storm Rising, so again, Clancy and Reagan talk about Clancy's next book in March of '85 in the White House. Clancy says it's about World War III, tells the president the good guys win. Book comes out in August of '86. Reagan reads it sometime in the next 50 days because he's flying out to Reykjavik on Air Force One, goes to the back of the plane to talk to George Shultz, Ken Edelman, all his staff about the upcoming summit. You think, hey, time to talk about, talking points, throw weights, numbers, yields, whatever. He talks about the book he just read. He calls it research for the summit because part of it takes place in Iceland. Everyone laughs. Very funny. Good joke, Mr. President. Surely this novel is not research for the summit. Again, we've talked before about how you come very close to that agreement to ban all nukes, abolish weapons there, except for SDI, holding that up. So Reagan comes back to D.C., and Thatcher calls him up, and she is very upset because the common thinking was that we need nuclear weapons to balance the conventional strength of the Warsaw Pact. And so she's talking to Reagan like, hey, great job at the summit, except when, you destabilize the balance of power in Europe and all. And Reagan says, well, hey, I don't see it that way. You should read Red Storm Rising. And so he's recommending this book to Thatcher, one of his closest allies. And the reason for that is Red Storm Rising, again, which the Times called Good News for Mr. Weinberger, shows NATO winning conventionally. There is no nuclear exchange in Red Storm Rising, as opposed to like the Third World War by General Sir John Hackett. And in Reagan's mind, I don't think he expected in '86 everything was there, for the Big Five of the Army and all the new subs and fighters and everything else and air-land battle to work perfectly and win. But by '96, he thought it was possible. And so I think that gave him confidence in this negotiating window going forward because it matched what he was getting from the Pentagon, what the Joint Chiefs were telling him. And so that's kind of where the book sort of served as a personal war game for him to think through this policy in the real world.
Great, Rich.
Okay. Yeah, and thanks for the question. So, the short answer to the question is I don't think Reagan saw any separation between the kind of Cold War instrumentality of that policy and whether it was intrinsically important to the United States or part of America's mission in the world. I think he saw the two coming together, and I think people in his administration also. The quotes that I put up on the slide there kind of tried to make that case that they didn't see any separation between that, and I think that kind of formed the basis for the kind of debate with Congress over this, kind of gave some grist for the mill that eventually kind of reached its fruition in the Westminster speech. That this is really America's purpose in the world, to promote democracy around the world, and in doing so, we will sweep the Soviet Union into the dustbin of history, or to sweep communism into the dustbin of history. And so I haven't seen any evidence that there's any sort of cynical motives behind this. And there certainly were opportunities. The right within El Salvador had a lot of connections, transnational connections with the right in the United States. There was plenty of opportunity for Reagan to kind of listen to that constituency, and he didn't listen to it. And then I would just say to conclude that he bequeathed that policy to the George H.W. Bush administration, which succeeded him and continued to pursue it and continued to mandate that there had to be a peaceful change of power between the Christian Democratic Party and a new rightist party that came into the political system called the RENA. There would be no more support for the government unless that transfer of power continued, even as the Cold War was winding down, even after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then even the fall of the Soviet Union. The United States still adhered to these sets of policies until finally the peace agreement was signed in 1992. So that would be my argument.
Great. Andrew, anything to comment on?
Well, I very much enjoyed hearing my fellow panelists, and thank you for the suggestion of the Schultz memoranda. I have heard of them. I've not yet investigated them as moving into this transnational, international diplomacy element is new for this project. So I'll be sure to investigate them. I'm very familiar with Schultz as a figure at this connection of a new type of systematized management and the business community. In fact, I write about Schultz and Caspar Weinberger, and particularly Roy Ash, as successive directors of the Bureau of the Budget / Office of Management and Budget, and the way that becomes a transformative computer using arm of the presidency in the 1970s. So it would be very interesting to make connections with there. So you've given me a great reason to make it to Simi Valley once my appendix is out. Thank you.
I love your condition there. Just funny. All right, let's take maybe a couple at a time. Yes.
Thanks for this. I would offer a counter argument to Richard's portrayal of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. I would contend that the ultimate political objective of the Alliance for Progress was not social progress. This was a counter-revolutionary program aimed at preventing another Cuban revolution in the Western Hemisphere. So social progress was not built. It wasn't the end. It was the means to counter-revolutionary. And so I see the rise of rights in U.S. foreign policy, first in Congress and then with the Carter administration, not being a reaction to the failure of social progress in Latin America, but rather due to the rise of military dictatorships in the Southern Zone and Operation Condor, which was very much saw itself as waging a third world war against the transnational forces of Marxism-Leninism. And assassination attempts, including our nation's capital, Letelier assassination. And so, in this view, Reagan actually returns to the previously counter-revolutionary policy and the pursuit of the reestablishment of relations and military support for the dictatorships of the Southern Cone, including Pinochet, is rather due to a view in which, Jeane Kirkpatrick expressed it, right, that authoritarian regimes like in Latin America could democratize, whereas totalitarian communist regimes couldn't. And so why are we treating these military dictatorships in Latin America as the enemy when really they are our allies in this broader struggle against the ultimate enemy, which is the Soviet Union and Cuba and, of course, Nicaragua and El Salvador, the FML. So obviously not a question there, but if you would care to offer a rebuttal to that.
Well, go ahead.
Let me ask you, just to keep things, do we have another question or two from the floor? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it is a question. So this is actually for Ben Griffin. I think you had a great presentation, very fun, very interesting. And I think it is absolutely evident that stories did matter for Ronald Reagan. They become a big part of not only his rhetoric, but maybe the way he conceptualizes the world. But importantly, they're a big way that he communicates with an audience, a way that he conveys, I don't want to call it, I guess, authenticity and honesty to his audiences, which seems to have a profound effect on the American public. But this question of these authors who are kind of consciously thinking about how to influence Reagan, and these authors who sit in these little think tanks and they write these books, and the Heinleins of the world, the other C. Clarks of the world, they may see themselves as having some sort of impact on the White House. But is there documentary evidence that Reagan truly embraces these viewpoints, that he's actually thinking about them? Because certainly a lot of evidence that he uses them as fodder in speeches. His diaries mention some of these popular culture things. But do we have sort of documentary evidence that this translates into sort of policy initiatives or domestic policy initiatives? Is there like a clear through line there? Or is it just, it becomes part of Reagan's zeitgeist?
Okay, two great questions. Let's go Rich and then Ben.
I think that you stated the kind of standard narrative that I've tried to revise with my paper, and I would say it's unfair to characterize the Alliance for Progress as purely a counter-revolutionary. I think there was genuine enthusiasm and optimism in the idea that by using these sort of big state-directed programs that they kind of jumpstart what they thought of as this modernization process, and avoid this sort of tilt into communism. And so that there was an alignment in the minds of 1960s liberals that there really could be a harmony of interests here. We could avoid communism at the same time driving progress. But I think it was based on a premise that Reagan rejected, which was that you needed to have sort of social modernity before you could have democratic government. I think that was fundamentally what Reagan saw democratic government as an inherent right, liberal democratic government, the rights of individuals, majority along with majority rule, as an inherent right of all people, regardless of how far advanced your society was. So that in the case of El Salvador, this effort by a very violent, imperfect society to try to come to grips with this and try to establish democratic institutions, while at the same time having gross inequality, having an inability to prosecute the armed forces, all at the same time. It was this effort to instill these institutions that could one day achieve this goal was really at the heart of Reagan's foreign policy. So I'll have to disagree with you on that. I think they're two incompatible interpretations of it, and I cite evidence. I'm sure there's plenty of evidence on the other side for that interpretation. So that's the best I could offer.
So I really appreciate that question. I think it's really well phrased, because there's different kinds of Reagan stories, right? So the ones that he is capturing and trapping in his little boxes that he's pulling out because they capture a core truth. And there's a consistency, because he's telling the same stories like back in the 50s all the way through until the time of his death, right? There's one about a doomed B-17 that never actually existed, but talked about what he thought heroism was in American service members, right? There are other ones that I think help him conceptualize things better, right? And that's the Red Storm Rising example, is that it's helping him to imagine what war could look like, and it's feeding into other things, right? That's, I think, most of the policy influenced ones are there, where it's not one story means he's going to do this. It's part of something that he tips the balance or helps him visualize or understand better. Red Storm Rising is a favorable example of that, but I mentioned High Noon. He would use that as a shorthand, right? This Marshall Cain policy, this High Noon policy, and that influenced some of the policy taken with regards to the Contras, right? Is that, hey, we're going to aid them because it's the right thing to do, even though it's breaking the Bolton Amendment, and we're not going to see credit on the back end of this, right? And that goes terribly for him. But then there are other ones that play interesting roles too. And so this is mine. There's an article, I forget who wrote it, but it's The Roots of Cyber Insecurity. And so it touches on some of Andrew's work here as well. But so Reagan watched war games. the movie with Matthew McConaughey, would you like to play a game? And he is in a meeting with the Joint Chiefs the next day or 2 days afterwards. And he's like, hey, I just watched this movie. Could this happen? And Vessey's like, what? We'll look into it. Okay, fine. And he does, right? Because he's a man of his word. And he comes back. It is worse than you could possibly know. We're going to fix this right now. And so, some of the efforts then to, these early cybersecurity efforts then are related to Reagan watching a movie and then having an off-the-cuff response to it as this gets broader. So for the most part, no, there's not a direct one. It's more of an influencer. On occasion, though, some broke through in very weird ways.
Okay. Anything else? If not, we'll wrap early and reserve a few minutes. Great. Why don't we call it a day? Thank you to all the panelists.